In the Vietnam War, there was a silent fear that every soldier carried with them. It wasn't just the fear of bullets, hidden mines, or helicopters being shot down in the jungle sky. The real fear was simpler and crueler: being left alone. Somewhere in the middle of that endless forest, far from the radio, far from comrades, far from any hope of rescue. Because in the Vietnamese jungle, when a man was alone, the jungle almost always won. But there was one soldier who decided to defy that rule. That stifling morning, the air felt too heavy even to breathe. The jungle dampness clung to their uniforms as if the forest itself wanted to hold each man inside. The small American patrol advanced slowly, breaking the silence only with the sound of branches snapping beneath their boots. They were on a mission that on paper seemed simple: enter, observe, and leave before anyone noticed. The war was full of these quick missions. Missions that were supposed to last a few hours. Missions that almost always went wrong. The group was part of a deep reconnaissance unit, soldiers trained to move silently through enemy territory. Each carried only the essentials: limited ammunition, compact rations, and a radio that was, at that moment, the only invisible line still connecting them to the rest of the world. Among them was a soldier whom the others respected almost instinctively. He wasn't the most talkative, nor the oldest. But there was something in his demeanor that conveyed calm even in the tensest moments. Some men said he was lucky. Others said he simply knew how to read the jungle better than anyone. That day, however, the jungle looked different. The patrol had penetrated several kilometers into enemy-controlled territory. The objective was to confirm troop movements that had been reported for weeks. With the advance of the Cold War and the increase in military operations in the region, each piece of information about force movement could completely change the course of an entire operation. They stopped near a small rise covered in dense trees. From there, they could see a narrow trail cutting through the woods. It was exactly the kind of route Vietnamese soldiers used to transport supplies and reinforcements. The radio whispered a short message. The base wanted visual confirmation. The men spread out silently, taking up positions among giant roots and dark trunks. Time seemed to move more slowly there. 1 minute turned into 10. 10 minutes felt like an hour. Then something happened. An almost imperceptible movement in the vegetation on the other side of the trail. First, an enemy soldier appeared among the leaves, then another and another. It wasn't a small patrol. It was an entire column. The radio operator took a deep breath as he tried to relay the information to base. This was exactly the kind of discovery that justified the mission. They had found something important. But as they observed the movement, something began to bother the soldier who was leading the observation. It was a feeling that was difficult to explain. The jungle was too quiet. No birds, no insects. Just that strange silence that sometimes appeared seconds before something went very wrong. He slowly moved his gaze to the left, then to the right. That's when he noticed something that made his heart race. Recent footprints in the mud behind their position. Footprints that weren't there when they arrived. That meant only one thing. They weren't just observing the enemy was watching them too. The patrol didn't know it yet, but at that moment, they were already surrounded by soldiers of the People's Army of Vietnam, forces that dominated that region of the jungle, and knew every trail, every river, and every hiding place far better than any foreigner could. The soldier made a silent gesture with his hand, alerting the others. None of them said a word, but everyone understood. The mission was over. Now the only priority was to get out of there alive. They began to retreat slowly along the same route they had entered. Each step was calculated, each movement made with extreme care so as not to reveal their positions. For a few minutes it seemed as if they had managed to escape unnoticed. Then the first shot echoed through the jungle. The sound was immediately followed by an explosion that sent earth and leaves flying into the air. Machine guns began to tear through the silence of the forest, and the patrol instinctively spread out in search of cover. The ambush had begun. In a few seconds, the jungle that had previously seemed silent was transformed into absolute chaos. Shouts, gunshots, and explosions echoed among the trees. In the midst of the confusion, the soldier ran to try and reach a more protected position. But before he could get there, an explosion shook the ground beside him. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the sky filtered through the treetops. When she opened her eyes again, the silence had returned. But now it was a different kind of silence, heavier, more dangerous. The radio was destroyed. His companions were nowhere to be found, and voices in Vietnamese began to echo among the surrounding trees. It was at that moment that he realized a brutal truth. He was no longer on a mission. He was completely alone in the middle of the jungle. And dozens of enemy soldiers were beginning to close in. When a soldier wakes up after an explosion, his first instinct isn't to understand what happened. His first instinct is to check one very simple thing. Am I still alive? That's exactly what went through his head when he opened his eyes again. The air was heavy, the smell of gunpowder still burned his throat, and the jungle seemed strangely quiet once more. For a few seconds he just lay there, trying to organize his thoughts, while the distant sound of footsteps began to emerge from among the trees. He moved slowly and realized his body was responding, though every muscle protested. His head was still spinning. A deep cut on his forehead caused blood to trickle down his face, mingling with the damp jungle soil. His first impulse was to reach for the radio. He knew that as long as that radio worked, there was still a bridge to the outside world. But when he pulled the device closer, his heart sank. The radio was broken, the display shattered, and the antenna bent as if crushed by a rock. Without radio, there was no communication. Without communication, nobody knew exactly where he was. He took a deep breath and tried to remember the last thing before the explosion. The ambush, the gunfire, the chaos, his companions scattering through the woods. He called softly to two of them, hoping to hear some response. Nothing. Only the distant sound of branches being pushed and voices speaking Vietnamese. At that moment, a very harsh truth began to take shape in his mind. This was no longer a reconnaissance mission. It had become something much simpler and much crueler. Survival. Soldiers who have served in Vietnam often say that the jungle is never truly silent. There's always some insect, some bird, or some distant sound of running water. But when the fighting is over, there's a different kind of silence. A tense silence, as if the forest itself is watching what will happen next. It was in that silence that he heard the voices again, closer now. The soldiers of the People's Army of Vietnam were searching the ambush area. They spoke quickly, pointed at the ground, examined the marks left in the mud. They knew there were Americans in that area, and they knew some might still be alive. He glanced around quickly and found a small space between the thick roots of a fallen tree. It was tight, but enough to hide a man if he didn't move. He dragged his body into that space and remained completely still. The footsteps began to draw closer. An enemy soldier passed a few meters away, then another. One of them stopped, surveyed the area, and pointed to something on the ground. It was probably the aftermath of the explosion or some abandoned equipment. At that moment, the American soldier's heart began to beat so fast that he was afraid someone might hear it. His mind started working fast. He still had his gun, he still had some magazines, but if he was discovered there would be no fight possible. It would just be one man against many. That's when he noticed something curious. Even surrounded by enemies, the fear he felt wasn't exactly panic. It was a different kind of alert, something many veterans describe after the war as the moment when training takes over. Training is something that many people outside the military don't fully understand. To those who have never been in combat, it seems like just repeating exercises. But for a soldier, training means that when the mind wants to despair, the body keeps functioning. He began to think about how he had been taught. First, avoid unnecessary movement. Second, observe everything. Third, wait for the right moment. As the enemy soldiers continued their sweep, he realized the group was much larger than it had appeared in the ambush. It wasn't just a patrol looking for survivors. It was an organized search operation. This meant they were prepared to surround that entire area of the jungle. For someone watching a movie at home, this situation might seem impossible, a lone man against dozens of enemies in the jungle. But many former American soldiers who served in Vietnam remember similar stories. Stories of isolated soldiers who had to rely on only two things: their training and their own brains. As the minutes ticked by, the Vietnamese soldiers began to move away from his hiding place. Some followed different trails, trying to find clues that would lead to other Americans. He knew that didn't mean safety. It simply meant that the siege was beginning. Slowly, he began to weigh his options. Staying there for too long was dangerous. Sooner or later, someone might return and check the area again. But running away would also be suicide. That's when he realized something important. The direction of the wind. Small details like that can decide a man's life in the jungle. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and churned earth away from where he stood. This meant that if he moved in the right direction, he could disappear among the trees without leaving an easy-to-follow trail. He waited a few more minutes, listening attentively. The enemy voices grew further away. The soldier gripped his rifle tightly, took a deep breath, and began to slowly crawl out of hiding. Every movement had to be silent. Every step needed to be calculated. Because now he was certain of one thing. He wasn't just trying to escape an ambush. He was trying to escape a hunt. And somewhere in that jungle, dozens of men were searching for him. He moved slowly, barely lifting his body off the ground. Every movement had to be silent. The Vietnamese jungle didn't forgive carelessness. Dry branches, thick leaves, and hidden roots could reveal a man's position from dozens of meters away. And at that moment, he had no room for error. The soldier breathed slowly, trying to control his body. His head still throbbed from the explosion, and the dried blood on his forehead hardened his skin whenever he squinted to see better through the trees. Even so, he kept moving forward. There was no other choice. Standing still meant being found. As he crawled through the vegetation, a question began to form in his mind. How many of them were really looking for him? It was impossible to know. In war, imagination is sometimes more frightening than reality, but there were clear signs that the area was being surrounded. He had seen the open trails, heard the voices spreading in different directions. This was no small patrol. It was a sweeping operation. Then he paused for a moment, pressing his body against the damp forest floor. If they were closing in, what would be the best way to escape? That was the question that could decide everything. He began to observe the details around him with almost obsessive attention. Small marks on the ground, broken branches, trampled leaves. Experienced soldiers learned to read the jungle like other people read a book. And at that moment, every detail told a story. Some footprints led north, others east. This indicated that soldiers of the People's Army of Vietnam were forming parallel search lines. It was a simple but efficient technique. By advancing in a line, they could cover large areas and push any survivors into a capture zone. He had seen that before, and he knew exactly what it meant. If he continued walking in the same direction, sooner or later he would find another search route. But then an idea came to me. What if, instead of escaping the siege, he went through it? This decision seemed absurd to any ordinary person. But trained soldiers learn something important. Sometimes the most dangerous place can also be the only safe path. He changed direction slightly. Now he advanced diagonally between possible patrol routes, trying to cross the gaps between enemy search lines. This required extreme patience. Every 10 meters covered took several minutes. But another question began to trouble his mind. How long could he continue like this? The sun was already rising in the sky, although it was almost impossible to see it through the dense canopy of trees. The humidity further increased the fatigue. The body was beginning to feel dehydrated. The mouth was dry, and each breath seemed to pull hot, heavy air into the lungs. He stopped again, resting his hand on the trunk of a wide tree. That's when he noticed something that had almost gone unnoticed. A narrow trail of water running between the roots, a small stream, At that moment, it seemed like the best news of the day. Water meant two fundamental things to someone isolated in the jungle: survival and concealment. He approached slowly, kneeling beside the shallow, dark stream. He drank carefully, trying not to make a sound. The water tasted of earth, but at that moment it seemed like the best thing he had ever tasted. And then another idea came up. What if he used the stream to disappear? Trackers look for footprints, they look for broken branches, they look for any change in the vegetation. But when a man walks into the water, many of these signs disappear. He entered the stream slowly. The water reached up to his shins. The bottom was uneven, full of smooth stones that could make anyone slip. Even so, he began to walk against the current, trying to keep his body partially hidden among bushes, leaning over the watercourse. Each step was slow, each step was silent. But the question that was beginning to emerge now was even tougher. How long would he have before someone noticed the trick? Minutes passed, maybe half an hour. The stream meandered gently through the vegetation, and in some sections the water deepened. This further obscured any trace. For the first time since waking up after the explosion, he felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps he had managed to get out of the search area. Perhaps the siege was over. But war is rarely that simple. As he rounded a bend in the stream, he froze. On the other side of the bank, less than 20 meters away, 3 enemy soldiers were walking slowly through the vegetation. One of them carried a field radio. Another pointed at the ground while observing recent markings. They were surveying the terrain. They were looking for tracks. The American soldier remained completely still, underwater. His heart began to beat strongly again in his chest. If one of them looked at the stream, if one of them decided to cross the water, it would all end there. The soldiers talked for a few seconds. One of them gestured towards the denser forest, and the 3 began to walk away slowly. The sound of voices faded. But something about that scene left a very clear thought in his mind. That wasn't just an impromptu search. It was an organized hunt. And at that moment, he realized something that few soldiers like to admit. He wasn't simply trying to escape the jungle. He was trying to survive 3 days that could decide whether he would return home or disappear forever into the Vietnamese jungle. The stream water continued to flow slowly around his legs, but his body remained completely still. The 3 enemy soldiers had disappeared among the trees, but he knew that didn't mean he was safe. In the Vietnam War, a patrol almost never went alone. Often there was another group a few meters behind, covering the same area, so he remained standing, observing every movement of the surrounding jungle. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe 20. Time in the jungle doesn't work like it does in the normal world. When a man is being hunted, every second seems longer than it should. Finally, he started moving again. He continued walking against the current of the stream, now with even more caution. The cold water helped to lessen the pain from the head wound, but it also made his muscles stiffer. His body was already beginning to feel the effects of extreme fatigue. Since the ambush, he hadn't truly rested, and the human body has very clear limits when it spends hours in a state of alert. Soldiers who fought in Vietnam recount that one of the greatest enemies was not enemy fire, nor the mines hidden in the jungle. It was mental exhaustion. The dense forest, the constant heat, and the feeling of always being watched created enormous psychological pressure. Military statistics show that thousands of American soldiers were removed from the front lines during the war, not because of physical injuries, but because of mental exhaustion. And at that moment, alone in the middle of the jungle, he began to understand exactly what that meant. After nearly an hour wading through the water, he decided to leave the stream. The terrain began to rise slightly, forming a small elevation covered in thick vegetation. This offered 2 important advantages. First, a higher position allowed for better observation of any movement around him. Second, elevated areas were generally avoided by patrols, following natural trails in the terrain. He crawled out of the water and lay down among broad leaves and thick roots. For the first time since waking up after the explosion, he allowed himself to close his eyes for a few seconds, but something inside him wouldn't let the rest last long. A simple question began to arise in his mind. How long could he really survive there? He had some ammunition, he had his gun, he had enough water for the time being, but he had no food, he had no radio, and he had no idea exactly where he was in relation to American lines. During the Vietnam War, many soldiers were lost in the jungle for days. Some managed to survive until rescue, others simply disappeared. The jungle could swallow men whole without leaving a trace. He opened his eyes again and began to observe the horizon between the trees. That's when he realized something unexpected. A very old trail crossed the terrain about 50 meters away. It wasn't a military road. It was too narrow for vehicles and seemed to be used only occasionally. It was probably a route used by local residents before the war turned the whole region into a combat zone. That sparked a new way of thinking. Old trails almost always lead somewhere. They could lead to an abandoned village, a river crossing point, or even some old military position. In a normal situation, following a trail would be extremely dangerous because it would also make it easier for the enemy to find your tracks. But at that moment, he began to think differently. What if that trail was being used by the Vietnamese soldiers themselves for patrolling? If that were true, it could reveal something very important. The direction of the enemy lines. He decided to observe first. For several minutes, he remained completely still, studying the trail. The wind slowly stirred some leaves. Small insects flitted through the heavy air, but no human movement appeared. Then he started to approach. Each step was taken with extreme care, always keeping the vegetation between him and the open path. When he finally got close enough to examine the ground, he noticed something that confirmed his suspicions. Recent footprints, some brands of military boots. Others were lighter, probably sandals worn by Vietnamese soldiers. This meant that the trail was still active, but it also revealed something more. The footprints were all pointing in the same direction. The enemy was moving westward. He slowly raised his gaze, trying to visualize a map of that region in his head. If the enemy soldiers were advancing in that direction, it meant they were probably pushing the search toward that area, i.e., he was directly in the path of the siege operation. The thought sent a chill down his spine. For a moment, he considered turning back to the stream and taking another route. But then he remembered something an instructor had said during training. In war, sometimes the best way to escape a trap is to cross the point where the enemy least expects it. He looked again at the silent trail. If he miscalculated, he would encounter another enemy patrol in a few minutes. If he calculated correctly, he could break through the siege. He took a deep breath. The sun was already beginning to slowly descend behind the treetops, announcing that night was approaching. And night in the Vietnamese jungle completely changed the rules of the game. Because when darkness came, hunters and prey would switch places, and for the first time since the ambush, he was beginning to consider a possibility that had seemed impossible hours before. Perhaps he didn't just need to run away. Perhaps he would need to fight to make his way. The sun was already disappearing behind the tall canopy of the jungle when he made the decision. For hours, he had tried to avoid any confrontation. Every step had been calculated to disappear, not to fight. But now the reality was different. The siege was slowly closing in, and remaining hidden only meant delaying the inevitable. If he wanted to get out of that jungle alive, he would need to do something every soldier fears doing when alone: create a breach in the enemy's path. The trail was still silent before him. The ground still bore the fresh marks of boots and sandals. Those men had been passing by recently, perhaps minutes before. He positioned himself behind a thick tree trunk and began to observe the terrain carefully. Night was approaching, and this completely changed the dynamics of the jungle. During the day, visibility allowed patrols to detect movements from a distance. But when darkness took over the forest, everything became more unpredictable. War veterans used to say that the Vietnamese jungle at night seemed like another world. Sounds that were muffled during the day by troop movements would begin to emerge again. Insects, animals, and the wind rustling through the leaves created a constant curtain of noise. For a trained soldier, this could be an advantage. The natural sounds helped to conceal small movements. He checked the rifle again. There were still a few magazines left. Not many, but they would be enough if used accurately. He also checked the body's position, looking for a spot where he could observe the trail without being easily seen. Then he heard something. Steps. First faint, then clearer. 3 shadows emerged from among the trees, walking slowly along the path. Vietnamese soldiers advanced in loose formation, attentive to the terrain. They weren't talking now. The silence indicated that they, too, knew they were in sensitive territory. The American soldier kept his breathing under control. He waited. The enemy men continued advancing until 2 of them passed the tree trunk's position. The third stayed a few meters behind, looking around. It was at that moment that he realized something important. That wasn't a large patrol. It was just a small, advanced group. Perhaps explorers were checking the terrain before the rest of the search team arrived. That meant that this could be the only opening before dozens of other soldiers showed up. He gripped the rifle tighter. The moment had arrived. The first shot echoed through the jungle like a dry thunderclap. The enemy soldier furthest back fell immediately, before even understanding where the shot came from. The other 2 instinctively threw themselves to the ground, trying to locate the source of the attack. The American quickly changed position, firing again to maintain the confusion. In war, surprise is often worth more than numbers. The Vietnamese soldiers began returning fire, but now they were confused. To them, it seemed as if they were facing a small unit hidden in the vegetation. The sound of gunfire echoed among the trees, creating the illusion of multiple positions. In reality, it was just a man moving quickly between tree trunks and roots. Explosions of grenades briefly illuminated the darkness of the jungle. Leaves and earth were thrown into the air as the gunfire continued. His objective was not to win that fight. It was merely to break through the weakest point of the siege. And then something unexpected happened. The noise of the fighting began to attract the attention of other patrols nearby. Voices emerged from further away, shouts of command echoing through the forest. The enemy believed that an entire American team was fighting there, and that created exactly the confusion he needed. He quickly retreated off the trail, plunging back into the denser vegetation. Now the plan was simple: disappear before the encirclement could regroup. But as he ran through the trees, another sound began to emerge on the horizon, a faint sound, a metallic sound, a sound that any American soldier would recognize immediately: the rotor of a helicopter. His heart raced again. During the Vietnam War, helicopters were often called angels of the jungle. They could appear suddenly and rescue men from seemingly impossible situations. But they could also pass right by if they didn't identify the correct position. He paused for a second, trying to confirm what he was hearing. The sound became clearer. It was definitely a helicopter. Maybe he was just passing by. Maybe he was looking for another unit. Maybe he didn't even know there was a lost American soldier there. But at that moment, he realized he had one last chance, an opportunity that depended on doing something extremely risky. He would need to signal his position, and to do this amidst enemy soldiers still scattered throughout the jungle. He raised his head, observing the dark sky between the trees. If the pilot saw the signal, he could attempt an approach. If I didn't see it, the noise would give away exactly where he was. And now the final question began to echo in his mind. Could someone up in heaven find him before the net closes in again? The jungle became tense again all around, and somewhere above the trees, the helicopter continued to approach. Now tell me something. Do you think he could really get out of this impossible situation, or did the jungle still have another trap waiting for him? If this story has held your attention so far, take this opportunity to subscribe to the channel. True stories like this show what soldiers faced during the Vietnam War and help preserve the memory of those who fought there. Also, like the video and write in the comments what you would have done in that situation. Many people who watch this channel have a direct connection to military history, and their experiences make this conversation even more important.